Look at these symbols, they match the pottery. Incredible. Document it. It's glowing, the light is revealing more. Keep going.
Stay back, monsters! You don't scare me!
Look at these symbols, they match the pottery. Incredible. Let me see the scroll.
Centuries
Careful,
after
it's
the
fragile.
Great Flood, the giant Nephilim reappeared on the earth as if nothing had happened. The question that has challenged theologians and scholars for millennia is a single one. How is this possible? If the flood was sent by God to purify the earth, why did the most corrupt beings walk among men again? It was taught for centuries that the flood sent by God exterminated every corrupt being on the face of the earth. However, the Bible itself contradicts that narrative with a prediction that is impossible
We
to
stand
ignore.
against your darkness.
The
Your reign ends here.
Nephilim, those
Perish.
beings of colossal
You
stature
dare
and
challenge
supernatural
me.
origin,
We stand against your
somehow
darkness.
survived
Your reign
the
ends here.
universal
Perish.
catastrophe. And what is even more disturbing, they were seen again by human beings centuries after the waters receded. What secret does the biblical account hold that religious tradition has failed to clearly explain? The answer lies in three distinct theories, and one of them could change everything you thought you knew about the flood. Before exploring these theories, it's necessary to understand who the Nephilim were and why their existence matters so much. The term Nephilim appears in the book of Genesis with an economy of words that contrasts sharply with its profound significance. Some scholars translate the word Nephilim as those who fell or those who cause others to fall, linking it to what is to come. Genesis 6:4 describes them as beings who inhabited the earth both before and after the flood. This detail, contained in just one line of the sacred text, is actually one of the most explosive statements in the Bible. The Nephilim were the result of the union between the sons of God, identified as angels, and human women. From this forbidden union were born giants, renowned warriors, beings who filled with terror those who beheld them. And everything points to God sending the flood precisely to put an end to the corruption they represented. However, more than 500 years after the flood, the Nephilim reappeared in the biblical record. The episode occurs during one of the most critical moments in the history of the people of Israel, at the gates of Canaan. The Israelites, who had been enslaved in Egypt for 4 centuries, were finally marching toward the Promised Land. Moses then sent 12 men, one from each tribe, to secretly explore the territories they were to conquer. The episode is found in the book of Numbers, when the Israelites sent spies to explore the land of Canaan. These 12 men returned terrified, with a report that would change the fate of an entire people for 4 decades. Numbers 13 and 33 record the spies' exact words: "We saw the Nephilim there, descendants of Anak," and they added something that reveals the magnitude of what they beheld. Compared to them, we looked like grasshoppers. This passage is not a metaphor or a literary exaggeration, but the testimony of 12 witnesses before an entire nation. 10 of the 12 spies returned convinced that the people of Israel could not face these giants and survive. Only Joshua and Caleb maintained their confidence, but panic had already gripped the masses, and the damage was done. The giants were there in Canaan centuries after the flood was supposed to have wiped them from history. This poses a major theological dilemma. Did God's plan fail, or is there something we don't understand? Was the flood a divine failure, or are we misinterpreting the scope of that catastrophic event? To answer this question, 3 hypotheses have been developed by renowned scholars of the Scriptures. Each comes from a different intellectual tradition and offers a different solution to the same enigma. None is definitive, but together they reveal the depth of the problem and the seriousness with which the experts have approached it. What they do share is the conviction that the Bible does not contain an irremovable contradiction, but rather a mystery to be deciphered. The first theory originates from a text not included in the biblical canon, the apocryphal Genesis. This document was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 20th century and dates from the pre-Christian period. It recounts something that, if true, would completely redefine the story of Noah and the purpose of the flood. According to this text, Noah's own father doubted his son's paternity even before he was born. The father anxiously wondered whether his wife's pregnancy was the result of an angel or the Nephilim themselves. The newborn's extraordinary appearance, with white hair and luminous eyes, fueled these suspicions. This description is not accidental. Rather, it reflects the belief that beings with angelic blood had unusual features. The father then consulted the patriarch Enoch, who reassured him, but the doubt had been forever etched in his memory. The mere possibility that someone questioned Noah's human origin reveals how much that fear weighed on ancient thought. This suggests that some thought Noah might have had angelic ancestry, being part Nephilim himself. If Noah carried that supernatural lineage in his blood, then the Nephilim never left the ark, because they were inside, and his descendants, even unknowingly, would have carried that lineage and passed it to future generations. This hypothesis was formulated in the 1st century BC, and many experts consider it an alternative narrative. It is not the most likely explanation, but it reveals something fundamental. Even in antiquity, people knew that something didn't add up. Even people of the past perceived the contradiction of the Nephilim's return and sought to explain it. The second hypothesis is more robust and stems from a linguistic analysis of the biblical flood narrative itself. Scholar Michael Heiser, Ph.D. in Biblical Hebrew and Ancient Semitic languages, offers a revealing perspective. Heiser dedicated decades to studying the supernatural background of the Old Testament from a rigorous academic perspective. His linguistic analysis of the Hebrew terms used in the flood narrative yields unexpected results.
Genesis 7:19 states that the waters covered all the high mountains under the sky, a seemingly all-encompassing statement. However, Heiser argues that in biblical Hebrew, the word all does not always imply absolute totality. Similarly, the word world in the scriptures does not necessarily refer to the entire planet as we understand it today. Genesis 41:57 itself offers a clarifying example when it says that all the earth went to Egypt to buy grain. It is evident that not every human being on every continent physically traveled to Egypt to acquire food. The expression, all the earth, referred to the world known to the characters in the story, not the entire globe. Applying this same logic to the flood narrative, it is possible that the waters covered only the inhabited region described, more specifically, the world of the peoples and tribes mentioned in the Old Testament up to that point in the narrative. If the flood was a regional event and not a global one, then the Nephilim who lived in other regions would have survived. This regional interpretation of the flood has both proponents and critics, and the scholarly debate continues to this day. Critics argue that if the flood was localized, then God failed to achieve his purpose of eradicating corruption. However, this raises a question that completely changes the focus of the problem and deserves careful consideration. Was the purpose of the flood truly to exterminate every Nephilim on the face of the earth without leaving a trace? Or was it simply to end the rebellion, protect humanity, and deliver a decisive blow to that threat? If the goal was to safeguard humanity from the corruption generated by the Nephilim, the flood more than fulfilled it. Most were destroyed, the rebellion was crushed, and the scattered survivors no longer posed an immediate threat. From Noah's perspective inside the ark, the water reached as far as he could see in every direction. For him, everything was submerged because everything he could observe from his position was effectively underwater. He had no maps, no global geographical references, no way of knowing what was happening thousands of kilometers away. What was happening on distant and unknown continents was simply invisible and irrelevant to the occupants of the ark. This narrative perspective would explain how the text can be true without necessarily implying a planetary flood. The honesty of the biblical account could lie precisely in that it narrates the events from the limited perspective of its protagonists. But it is the third theory that is most surprising, because it arises from a passage about something completely different. No one reading the text for the first time would expect to find in that passage a clue about the return of the Nephilim. The Apostle Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, speaks about the custom of women covering their heads. In chapter 11, verse 10, Paul gives a reason for this practice that has baffled interpreters for centuries. He says that a woman should wear a sign of authority on her head and adds a cause that seems out of place given the angels. What do angels have to do with the use of veils or head coverings during religious worship? To find the answer, it is necessary to turn to one of the Dead Sea Scrolls known as the Damascus document. This text, dated to the Second Temple period, speaks of angels called watchers who fell because they desired women. Their descendants, described as tall as cedars and with bodies as immense as mountains, are the Nephilim. The Damascus document suggests that this pattern, angels seduced by human women, was repeated after the flood. Xavier University scholar Troy Martin offers a linguistic interpretation that connects this whole puzzle. According to Martin, the Greek term used by Paul for covering can also be interpreted as that which covers or envelops. In ancient medical thought documented by Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Tertullian, long hair had a special significance. These authors believed that long hair was an extension of the female reproductive system, a prolongation of fertility. If a woman let down her hair while bowing her head in prayer, it was thought that this could awaken desire in the angels. Paul, in writing about veils, was actually making a direct reference to Genesis 6:4 and the fall of the Watchers. He was warning the women of Corinth that certain practices could attract the unwanted attention of fallen spiritual beings. This warning implies that Paul believed the fallen angels were still active and present in the world of his time, not as a historical threat that had been overcome, but as a spiritual reality with which believers should remain wary. This third theory, known as the repopulation theory, holds that the fallen angels returned to action after the flood. The same watchers or beings similar to them reunited with human women and fathered a new generation of Nephilim. This would explain why the giants reappeared in Canaan centuries after the floodwaters receded. The Bible doesn't explicitly confirm it in a single passage, but multiple texts point in that direction. The Damascus document, Paul's letters, and the book of Genesis together form a coherent and disturbing picture. The angels either didn't learn their lesson from the flood or simply chose to ignore it and repeat the forbidden act. And the result was the reappearance of the Nephilim in the Promised Land, precisely when the Israelites arrived to claim it. That encounter between the Israelite spies and the Canaanite giants was not a narrative accident or a mere literary device. It reflected a much older and deeper spiritual war that began before the first human being existed. The three hypotheses, the Nephilim in the ark, the regional flood, and the angelic repopulation, each have their strengths. None of these can be completely dismissed in light of the available texts, and each illuminates a different angle. The first is dramatic but unlikely. The second is linguistically coherent but theologically uncomfortable for many. The third best fits the body of textual evidence scattered throughout the scriptures and ancient sources. What is certain, beyond any doubt, is that the Bible itself affirms the return of the Nephilim without offering a direct explanation. This silence in the sacred text has been a source of debate, study, and fascination from biblical times to the present.
It is not an error or a careless omission, but perhaps an invitation to delve deeper into the texts with greater rigor. And the story of the Nephilim doesn't end with their reappearance in Canaan, nor with the victory of the Israelites over the giants. The narrative of these colossal beings of supernatural origin continues to unfold throughout the entire Old Testament. Every battle, every conquest, every confrontation between Israel and the giant peoples is part of a larger conflict, a conflict that, according to some interpretations, culminates in a final confrontation with a figure who would change history. The Nephilim, those beings who survived the greatest cataclysm in human history, left an indelible mark on sacred texts, on the traditions of ancient peoples, and on the mysteries that scholars still try to solve today. The question is not only how they survived the flood, but what role they played in the grand narrative of humanity and the divine. And the answer might reveal something about human origins that no religious tradition has stated with complete clarity. The apocryphal texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the writings of Paul together form a map of the same territory, a territory inhabited by beings who existed on the border between the human and the divine, between the visible and the invisible. That border, according to the oldest texts, was not destroyed by the flood, but simply redrawn elsewhere. The Watchers of the Sky, so called in the Qumran manuscripts, did not cease to exist when the waters rose. They continued to observe, wait, and, according to some sources, act upon the human world in ways that the Bible hints at. The Book of Enoch, although not canonical, is cited in the Epistle of Jude itself, which gives it an authority difficult to ignore. That text describes in detail the process by which the Watchers made the decision to descend and unite with women, and it narrates how that decision was irreversible, sealing the fate of those angels and their gigantic descendants. But if the decision was irreversible for the original Watchers, what prevented other angels from making the same decision? Nothing, according to the repopulation theory, nothing except the divine will that Paul seemed to want to protect with his advice. That is why he recommended that the women of Corinth cover their heads, not out of cultural modesty, but for a profound spiritual reason. He was warning about a threat that, according to his worldview, was still real and present in the world of his time. This continuity between the biblical world of the Old Testament and the world of the New Testament is precisely what makes this story unique. The Nephilim are not just an exotic element of the book of Genesis, but a narrative thread that runs through the entire Bible. From Genesis to the prophets, from the Psalms to the apostolic letters, their shadow is cast in different ways. King Og of Bashan, mentioned in Deuteronomy, was the last of the Rephaim, another name linked to the lineage of the giants. Goliath, the Philistine warrior killed by David, belonged, according to the scriptures, to a family of giants in Gath. Each of these figures is an echo of the original Nephilim, a remnant of that lineage that the flood failed to extinguish. And each victory of Israel over those giants has a meaning that goes beyond the military history of an ancient people. They are battles in a deeper conflict that began in the heavens and manifested itself on earth through generations. That conflict has its own rules, its own actors, and its own logic, which the biblical narrative gradually reveals. As the centuries advance and the books of the Old Testament follow one another, the pattern becomes increasingly visible. The giants always appear in the path of the chosen people, as if their presence served a higher purpose. A conflict that, according to the boldest interpretations of the sacred texts, has not yet reached its final conclusion. The story of the Nephilim is, at its core, the story of a violated boundary and the consequences that that violation produced. It is the story of what happens when cosmic order is challenged, and the consequences of that challenge ripple through time. It is also a reminder that sacred texts hold layers of meaning that go far beyond a superficial reading. And it is also the story of a God who responded to that challenge with the most powerful instrument at his disposal, the flood. But if the Nephilim returned, then the battle did not end with the waters, and the story continues to unfold before us. What the flood could not extinguish definitively raises a question that no generation has been able to completely ignore. Is there still any presence of that lineage in the world, or did its story finally come to an end with the passage of centuries? That story has a final chapter that most readers of the Bible never connect with the giants of Genesis. a chapter in which the Nephilim ceased to be the protagonists and became the backdrop for something greater. The Nephilim, those beings who defied divine order before the flood and again afterwards, met their end. And that end didn't come through another flood or natural disaster, but in a way no Nephilim could have anticipated. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that these beings, born of the most extreme transgression, had a destiny that, according to the texts, was predetermined before the first angel made the terrible decision to descend. The complete story of the Nephilim is one of the most fascinating, disturbing, and forgotten narratives in the entire Bible. And if you've made it this far, you know that the surface has barely been scratched and that there's much more to discover and understand. If you want to know how the story of the Nephilim ends and what it has to do with the greatest mystery of the New Testament, subscribe.